Hey guys, welcome to part 2 of the 8 forms of noise. Now in the last video we discussed the first 4 forms of noise. They were the time gap, the geographical gap, the cultural gap, and the language gap. In this video we're going to discuss the last 4. They're the literary gap, the supernatural gap, the theological gap, and the appropriation gap. Now these challenges are what scholars call noise or gaps in understanding. And these are anything that interrupts the flow of communication between the sender and the receiver. These 8 components, they come from Furr Kossenberger's book called Inductive Bible Study. Again, you may find these worded differently or see more or less of these in different places, but generally speaking, this is a great way to encompass the challenges or the gaps in understanding that we're going to face when we interpret Scripture. So, number 5 is the literary gap. To understand this challenge, you must understand what a literary genre is. Some examples in our day would be satire, the comics in the newspaper, maybe even an opinion article. A few more would be poetry, instruction manual, a love letter, or maybe a textbook on law or psychology. Now, we know intuitively to read comics differently than we would an article in politics, for example. We automatically adapt our hermeneutics or principles of understanding based on the genre that we're reading. Again, the authors from Inductive Bible Study give a great summary about the literary gap when they say, the literary gap stems from the fact that the Bible is an ancient human book written by dozens of authors in a variety of literary genres. As such, we should expect the text of Scripture to have been written in styles unique to ancient literary culture and language. What places the Bible in a class of its own, however, is the variety of literary techniques found in Scripture. Because the Bible was written by so many authors over such a long period of time, reflecting such a variety in purpose and origin, the outcome is a text representing a dozen or so primary genres and many more subgenres. The literary gap recognizes most readers will not inherently know the rules of engagement appropriate to the respective literary genre at hand. Yet, knowing these rules is absolutely essential in gaining more informed and accurate interpretation of a given portion of Scripture. The literary gap is a challenge that we can't underestimate. If I say I'm going to the store for milk, you or I would automatically understand it. However, if you try to read William Shakespeare's Macbeth, written in the 1606, you're going to have a big literary challenge on your hands. Even though it was written by or in early modern English, it makes little sense to you and I. We will need to use different principles to understand the phrase, fair is foul and foul is fair, for instance. The phrase is used to highlight the hypocrisy that people adopt to hide their true intentions. Now, Shakespeare uses this theme to caution about judging things based on face value. See, if we just tried to understand it literally, word for word, there's little chance that we would understand that phrase in that way. A supernatural gap, number 6. Now, the next 3 challenges were as difficult for the early believers as they are for us. The supernatural gap is a challenge because the Bible speaks about supernatural events and miracles as if they're as normal as natural occurring events. It doesn't try to explain them, and it sometimes even calls out God's followers for their lack of belief. The challenge is that to God, supernatural events are as natural as everyday occurring events. So when He is speaking to us who must mostly rely on our 5 senses, it can become a challenge for us to overcome. Furr Kossenberger put it this way: for modern readers who are steeped in naturalistic thinking, a supernatural gap opens up when they discover they can't replicate the miracles of the Bible in a modern scientific setting. The theological gap, number 7. We see in the Bible that God reveals Himself in the context of human history. This also means that He's been progressively revealing Himself, starting with the book of Genesis and continuing through the book of Revelation. Now, because of this, the Old Testament saints, they weren't as well informed of God's nature and attributes as we are today. In taking into account the dual authorship of the Bible, of God with each of the authors, His progressive revelation of Himself never contradicts earlier truth about Himself, but sometimes it gives a fuller explanation. Now, the theological gap poses other challenges too. Because God's eternal, He's all-knowing, He's omnipresent, He's all-powerful, sovereign, in control of everything. He is writing through the human authors about concepts that aren't part of our human nature. We don't have any concept about things like always having existed or being everywhere present at once. Therefore, we may be tempted to doubt that what we can't possibly understand. A good mindset when dealing with this challenge is to just believe that we have limitations in our understanding, just as there's a gap between us and dogs, for instance. Now, we can interact with them, but there's limits of understanding that would never allow them to build a skyscraper or learn to converse with us. Doesn't mean that we can't have a deep connection with our pets, though. In the same way, we can bridge this gap partially, but there's a theological gap between us and God that can never be bridged fully, as we're finite beings and God's infinite in every way. Number 8, the appropriation gap. Fern Kossenberger say this about the appropriation gap. Even once we bridge the gaps to interpretation, we still must transfer the message from the interpretation to application. This is often a greater challenge in interpretation, honestly, but absolutely necessary. Some commandments, exhortations, examples, and instructions in Scripture are directly transferable, while others are historically or theologically constrained and they don't apply directly to us. Now, between these options, many degrees of application are possible, including finding cultural equivalence and drawing principles from the text, both practical and spiritual. But this is a nuanced art that requires not only interpretive skill, but also spiritual seasoning and maturity. Now, even though these challenges are real, the good news is that God initiated the relationship with us and is actually more concerned about connecting with us than we often are about Him. So these challenges mentioned, they're not meant to discourage you, but to make you aware of your need at times to redirect your interpretation methods. In the next video, we're going to discuss some principles that we can use to overcome these challenges as we read through Scripture. See you on the next video.